Hello and welcome to the third episode of Huna, a new video series from the blog in Hidwana that brings female thought leaders from the MENA region to discuss the most pressing issues for women today. I am here with Aseel Alayli, the Director of Brand, Marketing, and Global Communications at Arab Barometer. She is part of the research network since January of 2018, and she is responsible for developing and executing the communication strategies as well as outreach campaigns that support Arab Barometer's goals and priorities. Prior to joining Arab Barometer, Aseel developed, produced, and managed international productions of current affairs shows, documentary series, and digital content for the Middle East Broadcast Network for nearly a decade. She is with me today to discuss the latest report from Arab Barometer on gender equality and women's labor force participation in Tunisia. Welcome, Aseel. We'll have a quick overview of the data from Arab Barometer first, and so just specifically, I'll ask over the past decade or so, we know Tunisia has gone through a political and economic crisis. So, in general, how do Tunisians broadly view the current state of the economy? Are they optimistic or pessimistic about the country's trajectory? And do you see major differences between Tunisian men and women when it comes to their economic prospects?
Yes, thank you, Faria, for having me. Indeed, over the past decade, we've seen political upheavals and social unrest after the Tunisian Revolution. And that, in addition to the lack of meaningful economic reforms in Tunisia, that had affected the state of the economy today in Tunisia. And we see that reflected in our public opinion survey that we conducted at the end of 2023. We see a widespread discontent amongst Tunisian citizens. Around 89% say that the economy is bad or very bad. And economic concerns seem paramount. Around 50% of Tunisian citizens say that the state of the economy is the top challenge facing the country today. Now, economic optimism is slightly higher. Around also 50% say that the future of the economy is going to be better in the coming few years. However, we also notice around a 14 percentage points drop since 2021, which shows that there is a slightly increase in disillusionment amongst Tunisian citizens regarding the state of the economy. And women tend to be slightly more concerned about the state of the economy, whereas men tend to be slightly more hopeful about the future.
Thank you. And then diving a little bit more into it, you mentioned how this compares a little bit from data over time. If you'd like to elaborate on how you see this change over the past decade or so, how does this data compare to previous surveys that Arab Barometer has done? And more specifically, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the key driver of these changes, both in the economy, but also in attitudes are.
Yeah, so actually perceptions regarding economic conditions in Tunisia have been consistent for over a decade now. Today, the views on the state of the economy are around 11%. The only time when we noticed optimism regarding the future of the economy was around the Tunisian Revolution in 2011. But since then, we've noticed a drastic or a steady decline in views towards the future of the economy, except around 2021, when citizens were hopeful about President Kais Saied and his government's promises regarding electoral reforms. And you mentioned the drivers for these kind of conditions. In fact, there are several factors that have contributed to the current state of disappointment amongst Tunisian citizens, from the political unrest, the social and security instability in Tunisia following the Tunisian Revolution. And then there's the widespread corruption. There's also the financial crises, and that have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, and which also have led to an increased level of unemployment rate. Today, the unemployment rate stands at around 16.9%. There's also the growth in the socioeconomic inequality, where more and more citizens are not able to afford having food on their table. In fact, in our latest survey, we find that around 2/3 of Tunisian citizens say that at least once in the past month, they weren't able to afford to buy a meal. And the majority of Tunisian citizens say that they blame the government mismanagement for this kind of food insecurity. So all this, in addition to the successive governments' ineffective economic reforms, have led to this kind of disappointment amongst Tunisians.
That was, wonderful context that you provided. In your previous answer, you mentioned that women seem to be a little bit more concerned about their economic prospects. So zooming into that, what are Tunisian women seeing as the primary barriers to their participation into the labor force?
Yes, so women's labor participation have been relatively low, and this have been a persistent issue in Tunisia. In 2022, only around a quarter of Tunisian women were participating in the labor force. And today, the unemployment rate for Tunisian women stands around 23.7%, whereas the unemployment rate for Tunisian men is around 13%. And this gender gap in employment have been consistent for over a decade. So at Arab Barometer, we were curious and wanted to understand, what do citizens think are the main challenges and obstacles that are preventing women from participating in the labor force. And our findings show that the barriers are multifaceted. However, what's interesting is that rather than the barriers mainly being cultural, we notice that they are structural in form. The two main obstacles that are often cited are the lack of job availability and the lack of childcare options. That is followed by the low wages and the social unacceptability, although only 10% say that it's socially unacceptable for women to work. We also noticed that there's another factor that might be playing a role, that is the concern about sexual harassment in the workplace. In another question, we find that the majority of Tunisian citizens, around 77%, say that Tunisian women face a significant level of sexual harassment in the work. So this can suggest that there needs to be an enforcement of laws that protect women from these kind of sexual harassment. And I have to note here that in 2017, there have been a law that was passed, Law 58, that aimed at protecting women from sexual harassment and all forms of violence. However, it haven't been fully implemented yet. So addressing these kind of systematic challenges can definitely help in facilitating opportunities for women to enter the workforce.
And zooming a little bit more into childcare, why is it that both women and men see this as one of, if not the biggest barrier to women's participation in the labor force? And what does this reveal about their attitudes towards who's responsible for care work and providing the solution to childcare?
Yes, so it's evident that caregiving duties can directly impact women's employment opportunities. And at Arab Barometer, we wanted to further understand, what do citizens think are the main obstacles and challenges within the childcare landscape in Tunisia. And our findings show that, according to Tunisian citizens, the main challenges are the affordability and the quality of childcare. 41% of Tunisian citizens say that the cost is the main issue, whereas 22% say that it's the poor quality of the childcare services. There's a 17% also who say that the lack of availability of childcare is the main problem, when also another 17% say it's socially unacceptable. And it's interesting that women tend to have more sensitivity towards the cost of childcare, whereas men are more concerned about the quality and the social acceptability of childcare. And if we want to understand these observations better, it's good to see them within the broader social context in Tunisia. And we notice that the gender dynamics in Tunisia are evolving. So although the childcare responsibilities and the domestic tasks tend to be unevenly distributed amongst parents in the household, and female head of the household often tends to take on the largest burden of these responsibilities. However, in our latest survey in the survey that we did in 2022, we noticed that there is a strong belief amongst Tunisian citizens that both parents should equally share the responsibility of childcare at home. So this can indicate that Tunisians are ready to support initiatives and policies that can promote and facilitate women's participation in the labor force, particularly if that involves quality and affordable childcare.
And then based on this data collected, you indicate that Tunisians are ready for policy that supports women's participation into the labor force. And we see the attitudes beginning to shift already. So what would be the most effective mechanism for continuing the societal attitudinal shift vis-a-vis women's labor force participation?
Yes, so in our survey, we definitely noticed that the role model effect can play a significant role in shifting and shaping societal attitudes regarding women's labor force participation. Now, women in Tunisia tend to be more supportive of gender equality in comparison to men, but we also notice a significant trend amongst Tunisian men. Those that have a female relative that has work experience tend to be more supportive of gender equality than men that don't have such role models. In our latest survey, 55% of Tunisian men say that they have at least one female relative that has a work experience. And this group, not only do they tend to be more supportive of women's rights and gender equality, they are more likely to be advocates for equal job opportunities between men and women. So this shows that having such personal experiences and such as like having a female relative participating and excelling at their work can have a positive impact on men's views towards gender equality. There's also another example of the role model effect that we see in our surveys that's directly related to Tunisians' views on women's participation in politics. So in 2011, there was a very progressive law in Tunisia implemented that mandated gender parity in electoral lists. But in 2022, President Kais Saied did electoral reforms that directly pose challenges on female political candidates. We see a drastic drop in women political representation in the parliament. Today, they stand at 16%, whereas in 2014, it was 31%. So President Kais Saied's actions from the removal of the gender parity in the electoral law and his dismissal of Prime Minister Najla Boudin, who was the first prime minister in Tunisia and a female prime minister in Tunisia, and the first female prime minister in the whole region, really. So his actions definitely affected the participation of women in politics in Tunisia. And we see that very much in alignment with our survey findings, where recently we noticed that there's a resurgence in support and belief that men are better at political leadership than women. Although previously we noticed that there have been a positive trend in support of women as political leaders. And what's interesting is that around the time or following the appointment of Prime Minister Najla Boudin, this is where we noticed the highest increase in support of women as political leaders. But then with her government inability to tackle the economic and social issues, And she didn't show a lot of interest in support for women's rights and advancing gender equality. All this, unfortunately, led to the doubts in women as political leaders. But I want to note here also something very important in our findings, which shows that the majority of Tunisian citizens, despite this setback, they still were supportive of the gender quota in politics. And not only that, the majority said that having women in politics can advance women's rights. So this, in a way, shows that the role model effect can have an enduring effect despite these setbacks, and have a positive influence on attitudes regarding inclusivity and equality within the political sphere as well.
So it seems to me like the data is showing a couple different trends. On the one hand, there's trends showing a slight decrease in attitudes about women's political leadership, but positive attitudes about women's support for gender, or general support for gender quotas and advancing women's rights. So how do you see or how do you evaluate these trends moving forward in Tunisia in terms of gender equality? And how can Tunisian women or women in general generate momentum given this broader context?
Yes, so Tunisia have always been and stood out as a trailblazer for gender equality in the region. And despite these setbacks that I just mentioned regarding the women representation in politics, our findings show that Tunisian citizens are committed to the gender equality in general. But to achieve this kind of goal really in reality, there needs to be a united effort on several levels, whether it's the government, the civil society, businesses, childcare services, the media, and definitely the legal systems. I think the women political leaders can play a pivotal role here in advancing women's rights and gender equality in Tunisia. And I want to emphasize the role of the media in influencing public opinion and public behavior. So Tunisians can leverage the media in order to spread their message of gender equality and women's rights. And that can be through the news coverage, awareness campaigns, but also through entertainment shows in order to ensure that we get the attention of everybody, and even those that are not interested in following traditional news. So I think all this can help in fostering a society of inclusion and equality.
Amazing. Thank you. It seems like there's generally positive momentum. You talk about the different levels and the united efforts required in order to sustain this momentum. Aseel, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, and thank you for going over the data from Arab Barometer with regards to Tunisia.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Of course.